And I'll tell you the story that I told you before off camera about George got very, very ill and was dying. And he called me down to his office and he says, you got to do me a favor, you got to do it. And I says, well, tell me what it is, George. He says, you got to do it. And I says, okay, what? I'll do it. He says, when I die, I want to lie in state on the House floor. Never been done. I said, okay, you got it. George died, and there was a lot of problems that we went through, but I'd made a promise to him. I even had to bring him up the stairs because you couldn't get the casket in those small elevators and everything, of course. But he did. He lay in state on the House floor for about 48 hours with Sergeant at Arms and members of the legislature there. And as I said then, this was George's life. Mm-hmm. This was his house as much as anything. I mean, you know, this was his house. So it was fitting that that occur. Right. But he was another one of the very colorful people that in the old timers.
Right. Who was your counterpart in the Republican caucus when you were Speaker? Was it Dennis Cawthorn?
Oh, it was Dennis Cawthorn. It was Bill Bryant. It was Mike Bush. They changed along the way.
As Republican leaders? As
Republican leaders, yeah.
And you met regularly with them in the quadrant meetings, along with the governor and the Senate leaders as well.
Whomever was the minority leader, I would meet with them and with the governor. And Bill Bryant was kind of colorful, too. He wrote a book. I don't know if you ever read his book about the seven people. Yeah. He sent me a copy of it, and I never really understood it, I guess, but I read it anyway. And but Bill was quite. Bill was always. It seemed like to me, he always thought something. I was trying to put something over on him, mm-hmm. and so the way I dealt with him was I dealt with him straight up, just straight up. Right. It drove him nuts sometimes because he was trying to figure out what I was trying to do to him. Mm-hmm. And he was a nice guy, very intelligent person. It seemed they had all kinds of Yale and Harvard guys on the other side of the aisle too, and Mike Bush was probably the most likable of the bunch, mm-hmm. And the most moderate mm-hmm. of them as well. But I got along with all of them pretty well. Occasionally we had a problem. The problem we had with the override.
Oh, right, and they were trying to get retribution.
Yeah, with some of their members, but all in all, I usually got along very well with them, but I tried to, something I learned from Bill Ryan, deal with them straight on.
Yes.
You know, don't try to have hidden agendas with them. Tell them what tell them what you're going to do, and.
You were faced with an unusual situation when a member of the legislature, a member of the House, Monty Geralds, was charged with, he was an attorney, mm-hmm. and he was charged in criminal court with felony charge. Mm-hmm. The Constitution of the state gives the responsibility for determining whether a person can sit in the House or Senate to that body mm-hmm. to make a decision. There is a provision that says if the person is guilty of violating the public trust, I believe mm-hmm. is the phrase,
mm-hmm. Exactly.
That they are automatically out of there. But in this case, as I recall, the Attorney General did not find that there had been a violation of the public trust. You were then left with the responsibility of how should the legislative body deal with that? Mm-hmm. What was...
I set up a committee to deal with the problem, to give Monty Geralds a hearing, and to look into all the facts of his accusations and indictment. They came back with a unanimous vote that he had to go. That's what they basically said. Look, he's committed a felony. He has misused funds of one of his clients and may be involved otherwise with the client, whatever. But we gave him every hearing, every opportunity, and looked into all the accusations. The person who accused him was interviewed. The whole thing was gone through. And when it came back, they made the recommendations he had to go. So I met with Monty and said, Monty, you know, it's obvious to me what's going to occur. It's going to be, if it comes to a vote, it's going to be an overwhelming vote that, you get tossed. That's it, period. So he said, I'm not going to do it. I met with him 2 more times. Once the day before the vote. And I said, take your colleagues off the hook on this one, if you will, because that's what's going to happen. It's obvious to almost everybody what has occurred. He still refused. As you know, the vote was overwhelming to expel him. And he was, and of course later on, you know, he was convicted of a felony and was disbarred, as a matter of fact, as a result of that. The same thing, not the same thing, but Representative Ogonowski was charged with a bribe, taking a bribe involving a lottery license. And Joe Forbes conducted the same kind of hearings and came back, same thing, that to vote to expel. In talking to Ogonowski, he agreed, given a period of time, that he would resign. And so Ogonowski ended up resigning. Of course, he was convicted and served some time as well. But those are hard times. Those are difficult times to deal with a colleague. But there comes a time when it has to be done, I think. And those were 2 of the times.
You had the experience of being the floor leader, and then as speaker, your floor leader was Joe Forbes.
Yeah.
And so you knew what you wanted, I guess, from a floor leader and so on. Talk about Joe Forbes and your working relationship. How did he complement your tenure? How did you work together?
Joe Forbes, my friend. And I'll tell you, he was a very good friend as well as a great floor leader. Joe Forbes and I would meet on the calendar. And when we got to the floor, we knew pretty much where we were going. And I never had to worry about Joe Forbes coming out of left field on something. If there was a question in his mind, we'd set on it. He'd say, okay. He'd go back, and that's what we did. Here was another colorful guy, too, Joe Forbes. Great guy. Everybody loved him.
Yes.
Had great stories. Always smoked that cigar, of course, and I'd put it out every time I got a chance because he sat right next to me on the floor. But he was one of my leadership group. He, Matt McNeely, and Gary Owen, who were the backbone of that 8 years, because they were with me the whole 8 years. Right. They were loyal. I never had to worry about getting stabbed in the back problems and everything. We met, we worked together, and it worked out very well. And Joe Forbes was floor leader under Gary Owen in his term as well. Who
succeeded you as speaker, right?
So so he just continued that, but he was outstanding. He knew how to run the calendar. He knew everybody in on both sides of the aisle. He had their respect, and that's very important, because even just as important for a floor leader as it is a speaker, I think, because the speaker, has to deal with some things sometimes that he has to make some bad decisions on, some tough decisions on. The floor leader has to keep their respect because he has to run that calendar every day, every minute, all the time. He has to be there running that calendar. And he has to treat everybody pretty well in terms of giving them a shot at their bills and everything. So it's very important to have a good floor leader. And Joe Forbes was outstanding as a floor leader. He's an outstanding individual, period.
I think people generally have some difficulty in understanding how do people fight political battles and then come out, being good friends and honoring each other and so on. I'm thinking of that in the context of Joe Forbes. Joe ran after you were Speaker. Joe ran for the position of Speaker against Gary Owen, who won, and yet after that they worked very well together. Yeah. How does that work in politics?
Well, it's like you're mature. And politics, if you're successful, if you're going to be successful, you better have some maturity. And most people in politics are mature and can deal with adversity and problems.